All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Anthony Monta. I'm the Assistant Director for the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here on campus. Welcome to tonight's screening of The Man from London by Béla Tarr. This is part of our annual film series. The theme this year is the best of recent European film. This film, I think, was made in 2007. But I just wanted to, before I introduce the person who actually knows something about Béla Tarr, much more than I wanted to make an announcement that after the film in Legends, the nightclub across the road, the Nanovic Institute is buying the first round for a graduate student social. So if any of you are arguably graduate students or actual graduate students, you're welcome to join us for a party following the film. And now, the Senior Associate Director of the DeBartolo Performing Arts Center, Ted Barron, will say a few words about the film to orient you to the strange world of Béla Tarr. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony. And as the Senior Associate Director of the Performing Arts Center, it falls on me to tell you to turn off your cell phones, any other electronic devices that may cause distractions during the screening tonight. Tonight's film is pretty long, just so you know. And lately, I've found myself, as I'm getting older, much less patient with longer movies. I'm very privileged to be in the position that I have here at the Performing Arts Center, where I get to look at films from around the world, get to pick and choose what kinds of things we get to see here. But I don't have a lot of time, it seems like, anymore. And it gets harder and harder to fit in enough time to really invest in the films that we want to invest in. I used to, when filmmakers would call me up to say, well, how can I get my film shown at your theater, I would jokingly say, well, make sure that it's 80 minutes or less, because then you'll definitely end up on our program, because then that's something I can actually take the time to watch. We all lead busy lifestyles. It's hard to sort of give ourselves the time to really invest in these kinds of experiences, and films are often easy to dismiss in that way. And that it seems like the more time we have to invest, the more work it's going to be, the more difficult it's going to be. Béla Tarr is a director who makes long movies. Tonight's film runs about 2 hours and 12 minutes, but that's actually a drop in the bucket when you look at this in comparison to some of his earlier films. Most notably his 1994 film, Satan Tango, which clocks in at a whopping 7.5 hours in length. In my previous position in the Boston area, we actually had a chance to screen that film, and we very wisely held 3 intermissions during the film so that we could sell lots and lots of popcorn, which we did. It was quite a day. But it's 7.5 hours of a single film. It's quite a commitment. But he didn't always make films like this. In fact, his career has gone through some interesting changes over the years, and I just want to talk a little bit about how his career has shifted over the course of the last 25 years or so. Early in his career, Tarr embraced documentary realism. He was looking to make films that were more in line with the kind of new modes of realist filmmaking that had largely been inspired by Italian neorealism in the 1940s, and had started to pop up in other countries, such as Great Britain and even in the US, where filmmakers were much more interested in immediacy, but also using that immediacy as a way to address social problems, as a way to deal with problems that were very evident at the time. His early 80s, in the early 80s, he made a trilogy of films which were known as the Proletarian Trilogy, which includes the films Family Nest, The Outsider, and The Prefab People. And these were films that were made very much in the tradition of realist filmmaking throughout history. They used non-actors, they used handheld cameras, so cameras that move through spaces using handheld camera movements as opposed to something like a tripod, which we see right over here. And focused, in terms of content, they tended to focus very specifically on the struggles of the working class. But in 1982, he directed a television production of Shakespeare's Macbeth, which took him in a very different direction. He started to move away from realist aesthetics into a different place, and started to embrace a more stylized approach, although that's always problematic to say, because it suggests that the realist approach isn't a style, because it very much is. But it's a style which used techniques which arguably could be considered more minimalist. The hour-long production of Macbeth the film itself consists of 2 continuous takes. The first shot lasts about 5 minutes. The second shot lasts about 55 minutes. So he's known for, at that point, starting to experiment with really trying to push the boundaries of duration and expectation. This turn toward more obvious stylization leads to Tar's more contemporary work, which is the work that most people are familiar with, people that know anything about Tar and Bela Tarr and his work. It includes films such as Damnation, the Werckmeister Harmonies, and the aforementioned 7.5-hour long Satan Tango, which is a wonderful film, by the way, if you have 7.5 hours to spare. Tar originally, as I said, Tar originally employed non-professional actors in making these films, and that's actually something that he continued to do in his later career. But whereas in the earlier films, the non-professional actors were seen as a kind of mark of authenticity, something that was sort of closer to the real-life experiences that he was trying to display in those earlier films. In the later films, he continued to use these actors largely because of their lack of affectation, their lack of expression, which is very much in the vein of the French director Robert Bresson, who was known for using models in his films as opposed to actors, people who didn't have the same kind of expressions or knowledge of how to sort of work in front of a camera that a more professional actor would have. In addition to this technique, he also moved to a very different style in terms of his cinematography, and this is something that you'll notice from the first shots of the film tonight. The jerky handheld camera movements of the early realist films are eventually replaced by more deliberate, very carefully plotted tracking and panning shots. So you'll see within this film these shots which go on for much longer periods of time than you've probably seen before, that you might sort of be comfortable watching because it just is a different kind of experience. But that's a very obvious sort of shift within the work. Also, the abrupt editing of those earlier films, in terms of the cutting process, how he moves from shot to shot, he moves away from that in favor of more minimal cutting, again adding to a very different sense of pacing that you'll experience in tonight's film. Also, instead of the natural locations, which were again seen as a mark of authenticity, a mark of the kind of immediacy of the moment, Tar moved into much more expressionistic settings within his films that are dark, dank, foggy. You feel very wet watching Bela Tarr's films often. There's a sense of real sense of atmospherics within his work, which is more akin to the early expressionistic works of the German silent era or American film noir. And it's interesting that tonight's film is in some descriptions kind of cast as a contemporary film noir, because there are aspects of noir, at least in terms of its look and feel, but in other ways it feels very different from American film noir. While the earlier films were shot in black and white, that black and white, like the realism, was often designed as a way to kind of evoke that immediacy of the immediacy of the early documentary films, whereas his more recent films use black and white cinematography to create spaces of uncertainty, spaces that don't have a sense of realism to them as much as they seem much more imaginative. The earlier films give us a sense of life unfolding before our eyes, whereas the later films, including tonight's film, will often repeat themselves in their imagery. The earlier films, it seems they move in unpredictable directions, whereas tonight's film, you'll see shot patterns repeated. You'll see actual shots repeated, where if you get a little sleepy during the film, you might think, have I just been watching the same shot over and over again? It has a kind of repetitive effect within the process. But it's also that the compositions that he creates within these instances have a way of being both claustrophobic, yet also panoptic, a way of, and that plays out specifically in the device you see within the film, which is the man at the center of the film, who is situated within a tower in which he sees a great deal of action from a single vantage point. The Man from London is actually based on a French novel which had been made into a film. A film version was made in the early 1940s by Georges Simeon, which was originally published in 1934. And the film itself went through a very long production process. Shooting was scheduled to begin in 2005, but one of the film's producers committed suicide in the process, which actually delayed filming for another year. So it went through actually a quite extensive production process. Also, they like many independent films, they ran into budget issues, and the entire film was originally scheduled to be filmed in the island of Corsica, but as budget concerns developed, they decided to move the interior shots that you see within the film to sets in Hungary, which is where Béla Tarr hails from, for those interiors. The film was also went through delays in that it was originally dubbed in Hungarian. You have actors from different parts of the world, all in the original conception of the film, speaking in Hungarian through the dubbing process. But both Béla Tarr and critics who saw initial cuts of the film were extremely displeased with the results, so they decided to go back and actually re-record the soundtrack that you'll hear within the film. So we hear the soundtrack that you ultimately hear is actors speaking in French and English, and in some cases different actors performing for the actors that you see on screen. So there's one actor who plays a police officer within the film. His voice, he's a Hungarian actor, and his voice that's actually provided in the film is by the British actor Edward Fox. So there's often some disconnect there. It also, among the cast, it features a mixed cast of British, Hungarian, and Czech actors, the most recognizable being Tilda Swinton, who appears as the railmaster's wife within the film. Now, for all this talk about the sort of slowness and the sort of deliberateness of the film, I should acknowledge that the film does have a plot to it. And that plot involves a man who witnesses a murder and discovers a suitcase filled with money. He steals it and then deals with the consequences of his actions and how they impact the title character of the film, the man from London, who's not the man who actually steals the suitcase. In more conventional circumstances, a plot such as this would serve as a guide for our cinematic experience, but Tarr presents this narrative as one of many offerings within his unique cinematic world. The plot carries as much weight in our experience as the experience of seeing a bunch of men drunk at a bar performing tricks, balancing chairs on their fingers and doing all sorts of crazy things. So there's a kind of different scope of experience that unfolds over the course of over the course of the 2 hours. The reasons why it's really important to see a film like this in this context is just, in very simple terms, Béla Tarr is a big screen filmmaker. This is, you're very fortunate to have the opportunity to see and hear this film the way it was meant to be seen. And this is something we say all the time in the cinema. Oh, come to see the movies, don't stay home and watch things. Don't watch them on your computer, don't watch them on your television. But when it comes to a filmmaker like Béla Tarr, this really pays off. Because in the way that he goes about setting up his framing, setting up his compositions, his sound design. Here I'll tout our fancy THX sound system. You're going to hear things in this film that you would never be able to experience on your home sound system. There's a real kind of immersive quality to seeing and hearing a film like this that I think I hope you find very rewarding. In Béla Tarr's films also, they not only do they ask, but they actually demand your patience, and I think that that's a good thing. They're films which question values, the values that we place in experiences such as escapism. Why do we sort of want to be taken for a ride for 2 hours rather than go in some kind of different direction? Why not watch events that might seem kind of mundane? But I think if you're patient with this film, you'll be rewarded because you'll start to get a sense of the experiences that Tarr really strives to achieve, and hopefully that pays off. These are also films that kind of reside in a place of not knowing. A lot of film experiences are built on the fact that there's a kind of knowing, sort of winking quality to them, that we kind of have a sense of understanding who the actors are, what their motivations are. We don't get any of that information. We don't get any of that sense of exposition in this experience. And it really doesn't matter, because the way that this frames our experience, those kinds of things don't ultimately have value, and there are a different set of values that emerge, which I think are unique and hopefully pleasurable in their own way. So, hopefully you haven't read too much about the film. I've given you a little bit of background on it, but as you go into this, I think your naivete about what this world is will ultimately serve you in having a very unique and unforgettable experience. So I hope you enjoy The Man from London.